It was a peaceful evening on the outskirts of a quiet rural town, when Mark, a reclusive but kind-hearted man, noticed something unusual about his golden retriever, Daisy. She had been behaving strangely for weeks, refusing to eat her usual meals, pacing around anxiously, and nesting in random corners of the house. Mark suspected she might be pregnant, though he couldn't recall any recent contact she'd had with other dogs. He took her to the vet, who confirmed the pregnancy but seemed puzzled. "This is unusual," the vet had muttered, frowning at the ultrasound screen. When Mark pressed for details, the vet hesitated, suggesting only that Daisy should be monitored closely. Mark brushed off the vet's hesitation as overthinking. After all, Daisy was his beloved companion, and he trusted she would pull through just fine. As the weeks passed, Daisy's belly grew larger than Mark expected for a dog her size, and her symptoms became more erratic. The night of the delivery finally arrived. Mark had prepared a cozy spot for Daisy in the living room, lining it with blankets and soft cushions. He watched nervously as she began labor, her whine filling the otherwise quiet house. He whispered soothing words, trying to keep her calm, but his heart raced with worry. After what felt like hours, the first puppy was born. Mark's breath caught in his throat. When he looked closer, it wasn't a puppy at all. Instead, lying in the middle of the blanket, covered in the remnants of birth, was a tiny human baby. Mark's first instinct was disbelief. He rubbed his eyes, convinced that exhaustion was playing tricks on him. But the cries of the newborn shattered his doubt. He carefully picked up the baby, who was unmistakably human, complete with tiny fingers, toes, and a head full of fine hair. Daisy looked up at him with trusting eyes, her tail wagging faintly, as if she had done something miraculous. Mark's mind spiraled into chaos. How could this be possible? He thought back to every moment in recent months, trying to recall anything that could explain this phenomenon. But nothing made sense. Daisy had never been exposed to anything that could lead to this. Panic set in as questions flooded his mind. Was this some sort of scientific anomaly? A bizarre mutation? Or something more sinister? The baby, though tiny, appeared perfectly healthy, squirming in Mark's arms and letting out soft cries. Daisy, though exhausted, seemed content, licking the baby gently as if she understood this was her child. Mark quickly wrapped the baby in a clean towel and sat down, staring at the bundle in disbelief. The shock of the situation was only compounded when Mark realized he couldn't simply call for help. Who would believe him? What would he even say? "My dog just gave birth to a human baby," sounded like the ramblings of a lunatic. He debated calling the vet, but the thought of the news spreading terrified him. This wasn't just strange, it was unprecedented. Mark's instincts told him that exposing this situation to the public could bring unforeseen consequences, not just for him, but for Daisy and the baby. He felt a deep responsibility to protect both of them, no matter how bizarre the circumstances were. As the initial shock began to fade, Mark realized he needed to take action. The baby would need care, food, and perhaps most urgently, an explanation for its existence. His curiosity warred with his fear, but one thing was clear: his life would never be the same. He looked down at Daisy, who had curled up around the baby protectively, her eyes half closed in exhaustion. Despite the impossibility of the situation, Mark felt an overwhelming sense of duty. Whatever this was, miracle, mystery, or curse, he would uncover the truth. Little did he know, the discovery of this human baby was just the beginning of an unraveling mystery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world. As the surreal reality of the situation settled over Mark, he realized he needed answers. He spent the next few days in a haze of research and observation, balancing the care of the baby and Daisy with his desperate search for any scientific explanation. The internet was no help. He scrolled through articles on genetics, mutations, and even bizarre conspiracy theories, but nothing came close to explaining how a dog could give birth to a human. Meanwhile, Daisy acted like a proud mother, tending to the baby with an unwavering sense of devotion. Mark couldn't ignore the strength of her maternal instinct. Whenever the baby cried, Daisy would nuzzle it gently, and Mark found himself feeling grateful for her presence, even as his questions deepened. The baby was healthy, which only added to Mark's confusion. He studied its features, soft brown eyes, tiny fingers, and a curious, almost knowing expression. There were no signs of deformities or abnormalities. The baby looked entirely human. Every detail made the situation more unnerving. Mark decided to collect a sample of the baby's hair and Daisy's saliva to send for testing. He wanted to know if there was some bizarre genetic crossover or contamination. The process felt surreal, but it was the only way he could think to approach the mystery. He sent the samples anonymously to a private laboratory, leaving out the impossible truth in his submission. While waiting for the results, Mark threw himself into caring for the baby. Late one night, as he was feeding the baby and Daisy lay curled at his feet, Mark began to notice strange occurrences. The baby seemed oddly aware for its age, locking eyes with him in a way that felt almost intelligent. The moments felt fleeting, and Mark dismissed them as his imagination. But the seed of unease was planted. Daisy's behavior also began to change. Though still affectionate, she grew more protective of the baby, often growling softly when Mark approached too quickly. It wasn't threatening, but it was unusual for her gentle nature. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. The house itself seemed quieter than usual, as if the air carried a weight he couldn't describe. The results from the lab came back faster than expected, and Mark's heart raced as he opened the envelope. The findings were both shocking and incomprehensible. The DNA test confirmed that the baby was entirely human, with no genetic markers linking it to Daisy or any canine lineage. However, there were anomalies in the baby's DNA that the lab couldn't explain. Unidentified genetic markers was the only explanation provided. Mark was left with more questions than answers. If the baby wasn't biologically connected to Daisy, how had it come to exist? And why did it appear to share such a deep bond with her? Mark's mind began to wander to darker possibilities. He considered that Daisy might have been exposed to something unnatural, some kind of experiment or phenomenon beyond his understanding. His rural property bordered a dense forest, and though Mark had always loved the isolation, he now wondered if it held secrets he had overlooked. Determined to uncover the truth, Mark decided to investigate the forest. Late one night, after making sure the baby was safe and Daisy was calm, he grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the woods. The stillness of the trees felt oppressive, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence. Mark pressed on, driven by the need for answers. Deep in the forest, Mark stumbled upon a clearing he had never seen before. In the center was a large, circular patch of ground where nothing grew, the earth charred as if by fire. Strange markings were etched into the soil, forming symbols that made no sense to Mark. The air felt heavy, almost electrified, and Mark's instincts screamed at him to leave. But just as he turned to go, he heard a sound that froze him in his tracks, a faint, rhythmic humming, like a distant machine or an otherworldly chant. Mark fled the forest, his heart pounding, clutching the flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he returned home, the sight of Daisy curled protectively around the baby grounded him, but the questions in his mind swirled like a storm. The strange clearing and the lab results pointed to something far beyond his understanding. Mark realized that this mystery wasn't just about Daisy or the baby. It was something larger, something that connected to forces he couldn't comprehend. For the first time, Mark felt the weight of fear alongside his curiosity. What had Daisy been exposed to? And what was the true origin of the child, now lying peacefully in his home? Mark's sleepless nights and constant worry finally came to a breaking point. He couldn't shake the image of the strange clearing in the woods, or the inexplicable connection between Daisy and the baby. Something about it all felt deliberate, as if he was being drawn into a puzzle he wasn't meant to solve. Determined to protect his family Daisy and the baby, he decided to return to the clearing, this time armed with a camera, a notepad, and a steely resolve. The moment he stepped into the forest, however, the air felt heavier than before, and the quietness around him was almost suffocating. When he reached the clearing, he was shocked to find that the symbols etched into the ground had changed, as if someone or something had been there since his last visit. Mark knelt to examine the markings, which now glowed faintly under the moonlight. They seemed to pulse with an energy that made his skin prickle. As he reached out to touch one, a low humming sound began to vibrate through the air, growing louder and more intense with each passing second. Panic surged through him as the earth beneath his feet started to tremble. He stumbled back, only to see a faint figure materialize in the middle of the clearing. It was tall and cloaked in a shimmering, otherworldly light, its features obscured but its presence commanding. Mark froze, every instinct telling him to run, but something held him in place. The figure raised a hand, and Mark heard a voice, not with his ears, but in his mind. "The child is ours. Protect it." The words sent a chill down Mark's spine. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. The figure continued, its tone calm but firm. "You have been chosen to guard what is precious. The child is the bridge." Mark's confusion only deepened. The bridge to what? Why Daisy? Why him? The figure didn't answer his unspoken questions. Instead, it began to fade, leaving Mark alone in the clearing. The humming stopped, and the forest returned to an eerie silence. Mark felt like he was losing his grip on reality, but the urgency of the figure's message was undeniable. Whatever the baby's origin, it was clear that Mark's role in its life was far from ordinary. When Mark returned home, he found Daisy awake, pacing restlessly. The baby was quiet but alert, watching Mark with an intensity that made his heart ache. He knelt beside them, placing a hand on Daisy's head and looking into her trusting eyes. "I don't know what's going on," he whispered, his voice shaking, "but I'll protect both of you, no matter what." In the days that followed, Mark noticed changes in the baby. Its development was far faster than expected. By the time the child was a few months old, it could walk and even mumble basic words. Daisy remained a constant guardian, always by the baby's side, and Mark began to suspect that Daisy's connection to the child wasn't just maternal, it was deeper, almost as if they shared a bond beyond what he could comprehend. As the child grew, strange events became more frequent. Lights flickered in the house, objects moved on their own, and sometimes Mark would wake to find the baby staring out the window at the forest, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. Mark's fear of the unknown was tempered by his fierce love for the child and Daisy. He decided that no matter how strange things became, he would never let anyone harm them. But his resolve was tested one fateful night when strangers appeared at his door. They wore black suits and claimed to be from a government agency, flashing badges that looked too perfect to be real. "We know about the child," one of them said, their tone cold and authoritative. "We need to take it for further evaluation." Mark's protective instincts flared. He refused to let them in, his voice shaking with anger as he demanded they leave. The men didn't push, but their parting words sent a shiver down his spine. "We'll be watching." That night, Mark packed a bag with essentials, bundled up the baby, and led Daisy to his truck. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stay. As he drove through the night, his mind raced with questions. Who were those men? How did they know about the child? And most importantly, how far was he willing to go to protect his family? The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the child was extraordinary, and Mark was its guardian. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Mark glanced at the baby, who was now asleep in Daisy's protective embrace. A sense of calm washed over him. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew this: he would do whatever it took to keep them safe, no matter what forces were working against them. The road ahead might be filled with danger, but it was also filled with hope. Hope for a future where they could live free from fear and mystery. Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter, his resolve stronger than ever. They were a family now, bound by something far greater than blood, and he would never let that be taken away.